26th of Nissan 5786, Monday, April 13th. We're slinging dick like it's going on the storm. 3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 3631, when 30 Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 235 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. This is coffee, Kabbalah, and coffee. Tonight. Berkata Adonai Eloheinu Makol HaMashiach Shadav B'mitzvah V'tzivanu Al Sefer HaOmer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us regarding the counting of the Omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 12 days, which is 1 week and 5 days of the Omer. May the merciful ones restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Selah. Whenever I hear that Selah, I always think, Sarah, Sarah, yeah. I also think of this lady from Shul named Salma. Really, yeah. Where did she? She has a fucking British accent, but I think she was from the fucking West Indies or something. Bullshit. What's going on with this shit? No.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane, history, philosophy, and religion. one of the aspects in starting to study mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how the ideas developed over time. It's technically, for instance, connection is one thing at all. Of course, neither of these things is really tenable. Such notions developed right developing, and there are actually schools of Jewish mysticism. And this class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah development from the modern Hasidism. This means study and reflect, and hopefully also enable you to situate developments in Jewish context, and hopefully enable you to dive into primary texts which are as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to the congregation Tia for allowing me to if you want entering the garden an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you
748.
after autumn want Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics of esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism provide full-time donation. You can find those links below. I really appreciate Alright.
Unauthorized.
Exploration of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Of course, I should be teaching this class one day a week for my life. Still not about Jewish mysticism and this last year. This is where my really runs out, and I'll be very frank about that. I hit a wall, and my wall really was nearly
Unauthorized.
should start learning of Hasidism and everything from roughly the 18th is where my gap is. Everyone has gaps in their knowledge. It's important to acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge and things we don't. And except from Hasidism, that's the real gap in my knowledge. Not that I don't know anything. Certainly people know a lot than I do. In fact, I've just invited a good friend of mine to I really do feel like I have drift and attention, a lot more deep attention, and so I've reached out to a good friend of mine who knows a lot about Hasidism to maybe do so we'll see if that works out.
Lunch and learn. In the beginning. Murphy. Center of the
20th century, I would say that we're not saying goodbye to Hasidism or goodbye to Kabbalah. Rather, we're saying
fuck.
It's going to continue to grow and change. Really cool and exciting things about developments in the city world, where we're in some new Kabbalistic thought, and we end up moving to getting into that. Seeing what's going Jerusalem. Well, as we marked last, the sort of post-Shabbatai world is, I would say that it's actually more sophisticated in many ways. The Shabbatai world is that's part of the why people really understand what's going on. They weren't really versed in Kabbalah. You can be overwhelmed by it, very influenced by things sound deep, but in fact they're not. And I think that's challenging at a couple of different bits. You realize that went on with Shadi and Frank are pretty facile. And I think that once you watch the surface of it, gold gilding, they abandoned it quickly. Evidence means the apostasy and actually the whole business. What you get is a kind of conservative back. There was that relatively conservative movement marks Kabbalah from about, and as we talked about last time, schools develop in the aftermath of everything. One of those in Jerusalem is America is a huge Kabbalistic. So Kabbalah continued to develop in the aftermath of the business, especially in the Sephardic world, not really rich, was much more stable than the Ashkenazi world at that time in terms of social stability and Jewish education. Again, I think I mentioned this several times ago that a lot of the people that were really seduced by the Shabbatian movement were people who had only recently really come back to Judaism. And so they don't really anchored in Judaism in a very profound way, in a way that, for instance, the communities at Marrakesh, the communities in Baghdad, they've been there for 1,000 years, easily 1,000 years. And so when they looked at the whole Jeff and Feet thing, they were like, no. So because they had a much deeper education, so the Sephardi world was a bit less affected by the whole thing. And so it's not surprising that in Jerusalem, they never accepted the whole Shabbati business to begin with. They excommunicated him as soon as they could. That one of the largest Kabbalistic schools in the aftermath of all of it developed. And as I mentioned last time, the two Kabbalistic schools take very different directions. The school, Beitel in Jerusalem, is going to take the form of really intense concentration or kavanah during prayer. And that school, again, will last basically until 1969 when the last adherent of that school died, which is amazing how long the school lasted for hundreds of years, although very tightly guarded, very disciple, student-oriented. And of course, the other is a Klois in Poland, and that is going to be largely influenced by Polish and Lithuanian Kabbalah and Jewry. And Polish and Lithuanian Kabbalah is going to be mostly remarked by its intense intellectual Kabbalistic speculation. And so out of that world is going to flow a mountain of highly intellectualized Kabbalistic systems that are going to basically try to do the work of systematizing Lurianic Kabbalah, especially vis-a-vis the old Quartz system, which I prefer. This period also saw, as I talked about last time, the rise of Hasidism. Hasidism is probably the most important, it's the most important movement in Judaism probably in the past 300 years. And Hasidism went on to spawn an entirely new system of Judaism, a new system of social relations, a new system of customs, a new system of dress. All kinds of things have come out of the Hasidic world. A whole new style of song, the Nigodim that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, come out of the Hasidic world. And so it's from that world where we have a focus on extreme piety, but also piety that is meant to find the divine every day. It's a piety in which God is lurking all about you, but you can't see God. The divine is everywhere. I think of the line from the Quran, which I can easily imagine a Hasidic Rebbe having written. The Quran says that Allah is to you in your jugular vein. That image in the Quran is always struck me incredibly evocative. And I can easily imagine someone like Nachman or Breslov having written something just like that. So the idea is that close to you. The obstacle is you and your ego are fundamentally you and your lusts and your desires. It's your desire to get rich or to have fame or to buy someone or whatever. Yes, these things that get in the way of your relationship with the divine, because the divine for the Hasidic movement is right there. You just have to do the work of tool of erasing the barriers between you and it's in the erasure of those barriers that one can experience the divine the everyday, including even in the movements of one's physical body, the sound of a bird. Some of the Rebbe's were even mentioned to be able to understand the language of the birds. They would listen to birds sing, and singing, having a theological debate that the Rebbe's could understand the Fagel Sprach, and that the Sprach allowed them to hear, the debates among the rabbis and the birds, which I always found really beautiful, like sitting in the forest, listening to the birds, rather than just hearing like the rest of us, normie people that all hear the birds. The Rebbe's, they don't hear birds, they hear the debates among the birds about God. And so I always found that to be a very beautiful example of Hasidism, where you're not just hearing bird sounds, you're hearing theological debates among the animal world. So again, of course, the Hasidic idea is a deep desire to experience the divine in every aspect of life and to cleave to God. The Vegas is the clinging to God, and you cling to God, and the way that you do this is at some level by cultivating a relationship with kind of shamanic character in the Hasidic world. This is the Rebbe, or sometimes there are tzaddikim, tzaddukim. There are these righteous people who have a unique relationship with God. They're intensely holy. And of course, these Rebbes go on to set up various courts, and those courts really operate a bit like royalty. They still do operate a bit like royalty even to this day. And so you have a loyalty to the Rebbe, to your Rebbe. And the Chassid encounters the divine primarily through the Rebbe, and it's in that Rebbe Chassid relationship that Chassidism really grows up into one of the sort of court-like spirituality that it is today. We'll talk a little bit about how that's gotten a little stranger, especially with the Chabad movement, which I forgot to mention much in the later slide. I'll need to talk about that a little bit as well, but we'll see how that develops. So, as we stopped last time, the sort of cliffhanger from last time was that what I think that no one really realized in the aftermath of the whole Shabbatai Tzvi thing, that as much as the Shabbatai Tzvi business was a disaster, no one really saw what was happening in the background that was a bigger deal. The same year the Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam and apostatized in 1666, and I'm sure as many folks in the room know, 1666 is a dynamite year in the history of science. It's the year that Isaac Newton discovered or invented calculus. Of course, he discovered it at the same time as Leibniz. There's a bitter debate about that. It's also the same year that Newton discovered the fundamental nature of light, and also he basically figured out Newtonian physics as we know it now. And he published all that in 1666. This is called the Year of Miracles. So at the same time that Newton is figuring all that out, inventing calculus and all this stuff, that's the year Shabbatai Tzvi converts to Islam. So it's difficult. I know that for many people, and for me too, when I think about Shabbatai's conversion, I think that it's a medieval thing. That's something that happened a long, long time ago. And I think of somehow Newton not having happened a long, long time ago. Newton feels very modern to me. It feels like I could just sort of, we can play chess with somebody on Star Trek. And they happen at the same time. They happen the exact same year. And so what's coming down the pipe, and what I think the Jewish world did not see in the aftermath of this entire Shabbatai Tzvi business, was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was happening all around the Jewish world, in France, in North America, in England, and Holland, and Germany. The Enlightenment was developing a huge, completely new worldview that was dynamically breaking from what had come from before, with its its emphasis on rationality, its emphasis on experimental science, its emphasis on extreme logic. And so we're beginning to get philosophers like Descartes, like Spinoza. Spinoza's philosophy rejects there's a God separate from nature. It's just nature, and nature is God, and God is nature. It's the same thing. We're getting the mechanistic philosophers. The philosophers believe that all of nature is like a giant machine. If you study it carefully, you can understand how it works. And if you understand how it works, you can predict it, and therefore you can make it do things for you. This incredibly mechanistic philosophy, which is in many ways really wonderful and things like that. Inside the Jewish world, they never saw this coming. It just sort of landed on their doorstep. When I say landed on their doorstep, what I really mean is Napoleon showed up. What Hegel called the world spirit on horseback. Napoleon shows up in Central Europe and even Eastern Europe and marched all the way to Russia. So everywhere Napoleon went, he brought with him these Enlightenment ideas. His army was a sort of enlightened army. It's not just the armies that are ever enlightened. And Napoleon brought with him the metric system. He brought with him French Revolutionary ideas. He brought with him the idea that if you're a citizen of a country, then you should have equal protection under the law. There should never be second-class citizens. Either you're a citoyen or you're not. And if you are citoyen, you have the rights and privileges of everyone else that is protected by the rational law. And of course, I'm not saying Napoleon was perfect or anything like that, but he was a big enough deal that Hegel thought at some level he represented the very movement of Geist, the very movement of God, in the realization of Godness in the world. And of course, Hegel got disappointed with it later, but made a big impression on the young Hegel. And so this is at the same time that the Hasidic movement is taking off. And so when these two movements are in conflict with each other, when they contact each other, there's going to be a break-off in the Jewish world where some Jews are going to become very attracted to Enlightenment values, and they're going to incorporate those Enlightenment values into the Jewish world. And that is called the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And I think for almost everyone here in this class, and almost probably everyone hearing my voice, all of us are pretty enticed with some of my Enlightenment ideas. The idea of equal protection under the law, that you can't be just killed because of what you believe in, that we have a rational system of weights and measures in this country, but most countries in the world, that the scientific, the very fact that I'm talking to you through this machine is proof of the success of the Enlightenment. So for many Jews, the Enlightenment was a solution to so many problems in the Jewish world, both in terms of the inner backwardness of the Jewish world, what they thought to be a superstitious world ruled by elite dynastic rulers who divine the will of God, and who knows how they figured these things out. And they believed in werewolves and vampires, and they believed in all this stuff in Kabbalah. Many Jews were very disenfranchised with that and wanted to rush into the world of the Enlightenment, and they did. They did. In fact, for the Jewish folks here, I imagine for many of the Jewish folks in this class, you are the children of the great-great-great-grandchildren of the masculine, of the Enlightenment folks. Because the Enlightenment was very, very successful, again, for better and for worse. So what ends up happening is that this new kind of rational Judaism, the integration of Enlightenment values with Judaism became, incredibly polarizing. We also, speaking again for the Jewish folks in the room, we live in an incredibly easy world compared to our ancestors. Because in many ways we can adapt both worlds. We can be religious and we can be in the Enlightenment somehow. Well, there was no middle ground in the 18th century. Either you jumped ship and you joined the Enlightenment camp, or you stayed behind in the shtetl and you stayed in the world of the pre-Enlightenment, or the traditional world, I suppose one could say. And so in the traditional world, they realized how much of a threat this was. They were terrified of this, and they doubled down on the traditional aspects of the world. And so in many ways, both Enlightenment Judaism and Haredi Judaism, that is to say the black hat, ultra-Orthodox Judaism that we recognize now, are both actually creations of the Enlightenment. So I know that sometimes Haredi folks like to pretend as if they're the legitimate continuers and heirs of a discrete, continuous line of Judaism reaching all the way back to Moses. And if you ask them, Moses wore a black hat and spoke Yiddish. But I guarantee you he didn't. The reality of modern Judaism is at some level all of it is a response to the Haskalah. It's all a response. Either you double down on tradition and you retreat it into the world of the dynastic world, of the Hasidic world, or the Litvish world, or you drifted off into the secular world and you tried to make a go at either becoming assimilated or you tried to balance out both. Assimilation was the largest, the earliest movement. So what we have here basically is a choice between some level of assimilation, right? As much as those countries that allow you to assimilate, whether it's the French and the Germans, and as you know from the terrifying history of how this will go, it will fail. Assimilation ultimately was a failed strategy. It did not protect Jews in the end. And neither did God, by the way. It wasn't like majority people were protected when the first Panthers rolled in. And so what we have is a dualistic, a polarized world by the 1700s in which there are Haskalah Jews and then there are traditional Jews. And the world becomes polarized. It becomes increasingly polarized. Now, that's not to say that Kabbalah stops. If all the kinds of things that have not stopped the Kabbalah hadn't stopped them, when there was the Crusades or the Chapter V event or whatever pogroms would have stopped the Kabbalah, well, this whole Enlightenment thing didn't stop it either. And so many of the traditional centers of Judaism in the medieval or in the early modern world, they continued to produce Kabbalah as if nothing was going on. For them, they may have not even known. And so, especially in the Hasidic world, there is a huge outpouring of literature. This is the time where the folks in the Chabad movement, I'm sure many folks I've had contact with, they began very rigorously their movement. Also, it's now that the Chabad movement is sort of the intellectual center in many ways of the Hasidic movement. They become much more interested in the world of the mind and the world of the intellect as opposed to just the world of the emotions. And so the Chabad movement actually becomes much more of a rigorous system of Hasidic philosophy as opposed to just singing songs and being happy or whatever. So this is a period of people like Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which I imagine most folks have heard of. Nachman of Breslov is probably one of the most famous rabbis of this time period, was known for his deep spiritual, existential torment experiences. He was a person of great highs and great lows. So I guess most historical people who we end up remembering are kind of manic depressive in this way, and so Rabbi Nachman is known for this extreme joy and extreme sorrow he was capable of feeling. And ultimately, he's going to give rise to the Neo-Hasidic movement, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also the Nanach movement, which I imagine if you've ever been to spend time in Israel, you will at some point encounter some Nanach guys, which tend to smell as pious as they are. They wear the knit cap with Nanach written on it. They listen to techno music and dance around. They're generally pious to a fault. So those guys are out there and they're a big deal in the Neo-Hasidic world. Of course, also at this time period, probably one of the most important modern Jewish philosophers and mystics is also writing. This is a Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, probably the greatest traditional Jewish mind of the early modern period. And Luzzatto wrote a mountain of stuff. It's really, I was looking over some of it today and I was like, my God, this guy wrote 50 books. I've probably read one or two of them. He wrote 50-something books. It's an enormously huge output. But the Ramchal is known as a young man for having had a spiritual experience where he had a Magi, or a spiritual teacher, who began to reveal him all kinds of spiritual things. He was relatively young when this happened, and you can imagine that in the aftermath of the Shabbatai Tzvi business, no one wanted to hear about anyone talking to the spirits anymore. And so he kind of got kicked out of Italy a little bit. He kind of got expelled from Italy, and this led him on a journey through Europe. And in his journey, like I said, a ton of stuff. His two most famous books are Derech Hashem, The Way of the Lord. Derech Hashem is probably the most systematic, collection or systematization of Judaism that incorporates both philosophical issues and Kabbalah into one system. Derech Hashem is a really, really great one. You can get it in Hebrew and English if you want to study it. It's a fantastic text. It really does the work of combining the sort of philosophy of the day. Although the philosophy of that one is a little outdated, but it's still a very amazing book. His other major book is the book on ethics, Masiwa Yashari, which is also just really, really great to read, and also you can get it in English too. And both of these books have gone to become basic classics in the Orthodox world. They still people. There's even study sessions, and they study these books over and over and over again all through the year. So Derek Hashem and Masiwa Yashari are classics of Judaism. They become classics of Judaism, and again, they incorporate Kabbalistic and non-Kabbalistic philosophical elements into one text. Again, Chaim Luzzatto is probably say he's the most important rabbi in this field. Some level, he's probably the most important rabbi in this field. And so, very, very important guy. Also, over in Eastern Europe, they're also continuing to do classical Kabbalah. A lot of what's happening at this point in Kabbalistic texts is a lot of systematization texts, which are trying to systematize the Lurianic system. But also there are a lot of encyclopedic texts, where they're just going through and trying to list things and describe what things are. One of the problems that comes along with work is that the Hebrew language just isn't actually that good at doing philosophy. There are a lot of technical reasons why this is. German is a far better language for doing philosophy, even than English. And Hebrew is a sort of clumsy language when it comes to doing philosophy. And it's also a bit of a clumsy language when it comes to doing Kabbalah, ironically enough. And so a lot of the technical terms in Kabbalah are very, very confusing. And a lot of what happens during this time period is the encyclopedizing of Kabbalah. And one of the more famous encyclopedias that gets written at this time is one of the books I would love to see translated. I have it downstairs, but I can read it. Translating it is beyond me. But it's the Sefer Karnaim. Sefer Karnaim is an encyclopedia of the Klipot. The Klipot, as you may remember, are the shards left over in the process of creating the world, and those shards that are left over are actually demonic. Those are the demons that sort of haunt the Lurianic world, and it's an encyclopedia of all the demons. And so we actually get a systematic account of the evil detritus left over from the creation of the world here in the 18th, 19th centuries of the Sefer Karnaim, which is a fabulous, interesting text. You can read it online for free. Of course, you can read the translations online. Now, as you probably also know, in all of this, through the 19th century, the amount of anti-Semitism in Europe doesn't go away. Anti-Semitism has always been there in Europe. It's always been European anti-Semitism. Well, the anti-Semitism gets a new added dimension. As you might imagine, as Jews become more and more part of secular civil society, there's also anti-Semitism that emerges at the level of discrimination of Jews in secular civil society. Of course, the most famous and infamous example of this is the Dreyfus Affair in the 19th century in France. And so, with this uptick in anti-Semitism and the ongoing reality of anti-Semitism, there's sort of three distinct ideas basically about what to do about it. One idea is the traditional idea: double down on being pious and God will protect you. It's going to go in theory for many thousands of years, but that theory no one's given up on yet. So one is double down on being pious and God will protect you. The other theory is that you just need to get out of Europe. Europe is just a death trap. We've been living in Europe now for 1,000 years, and for 1,000 years, it's just been a nightmare. It's just been pogrom after crusade, after blood libel, after witch hunt, after whatever. It is that the Europeans are never going to accept us, and at some level, eventually they're going to try to kill us all. It's just a matter of time. It turns out they were right. So what do? You leave. You leave Europe. You pack your bags, and you leave Europe. And in the mid-19th century, that idea takes the form of secular Zionism. This is where Haskalah Jews, enlightened Jews, decide as a group that the situation in Europe is basically untenable and we need to leave. And this is the emergence, of course, of very, very nascent Zionism. Now, two things that are worth noting here about really early Zionism is that it was entirely a secular movement at first. In fact, it didn't really get to have much religious backing in the 20th century, frankly. And so Zionism was a secular, largely socialist movement, although not all of it was socialist. Not all of socialism was recognized now. And that movement, while it did accept some messianic themes, and it was sort of apocalyptic in its narrative and its way it talked about the world. It wasn't really informed by Kabbalah, but I think that it was informed. If you read a lot of the language of the early Zionists, you will see a lot of the exile redemption language. You will see a lot of language that is coming in from the Kabbalah, although I think it's mostly due to social osmosis, right? So, let me make that more clear, put a finer point on it. The Zionist movement early on was never informed by Kabbalah directly, although I think that there is some messianic and some Kabbalistic ideas that reached into Zionism, mostly because of sort of social osmosis, because of Jews, and they've been raised on a diet of Kabbalah and Torah. So that's one part of it. The other part of it with the Zionist movement is that, from a religious perspective, it was completely remote. It was completely at a Vera. The religious world rejected Zionism very early on. And when I say the religious world rejected Zionism, most of the religious world still rejects Zionism. It still says Zionism is a toxic ideology that is harmful to Palestinians, and it is irreligious. It's blasphemous. It's straight up heresy. And so this early, and I said even the Reform movement very early on, even the Reform movement in Germany, at the very beginning of the Reform movement, they rejected Zionism in two major conferences. So even at the very far progressive end of the Jewish world, Zionism was very unpopular, at least to start. And it remains unpopular now, at least in the Haredi world. Folks have been watching the very wonderful show Shtisel, soap opera, basically. You'll know in Shtisel, right, every time that they bring the Zionist up, Shulam's brother always says, he refers to the Zionism, he refers to Zionism as Shulam, the evil people. And what's called Shulam, the evil people. And so this is the thing that developed early on in the response to Zionism. So it never became religious until much later. In fact, I would say that in many ways it wasn't until Rav Kook, who we'll talk about in a minute, and it certainly wasn't until I think after the idea war that in a big way you get religious Zionism where you recognize it now. I think it's a relatively minority movement. The Kabbalah, of course, continues to develop, right? It's not like the Kabbalah stops. Slide. Oh yes, this is a mistaken slide, but there's an extra thing down here I want to talk about. I must have mucked this slide up. But anyway, the last thing I want to talk about here is that in the 19th century, what also happens in the non-Jewish world is there's sometimes what is referred to as the occult revival. The occult revival was a re-interest in occult sciences, alchemy, and sort of a romantic interest in this stuff. And what you get are people like Ebenezer Sibley and Barrett, who are people who published the Magus. You have a bunch of people really interested in the occult again, and this sort of occult revival that occurred primarily in the 19th century also incorporates some older elements of Christian Kabbalah, and they ultimately develop a new form of Kabbalah out of Christian Kabbalah that gets referred to as the Hermetic Kabbalah. And this is a completely non-Jewish, occult-centered version of the Kabbalah, primarily used for engaging in ceremonial magic. So we have elements of Freemasonry being combined with elements of Renaissance magic, and then that being fused together with some elements of Kabbalah, and that develops what we now refer to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is another third branch of Kabbalah that is developed. There's Jewish Kabbalah with a K, there is Christian Kabbalah with a C, and now this develops eventually in the early 19th century, 20th century into Hermetic Kabbalah with a Q. And these forms of Kabbalah continue into occult practice all the way to this day. So again, in the 19th century, Kabbalah undergoes another mutation, although not a Jewish mutation, but primarily in the non-Jewish world, primarily in England, where this occult revival will take place. And so the Hermetic Kabbalah is out there, and the Kabbalah is a whole big world of people whose spirituality is wrapped up with the very sophisticated, very complicated system of consciousness, typically referred to as. So as I mentioned, right, just a minute ago, one of the other strategies, right, so we have one strategy, double down in traditional. The other strategy is leave, go to Palestine or wherever. And the other strategy that I mentioned a minute ago too is assimilation. Assimilation was a very daring strategy, and perhaps I think one of the more difficult. I think that many of the people who did the job of assimilating, I think, get written off as traitors or something. I think it's really unfortunate the way we talk about that generation of folks. But assimilation was a really difficult task of trying to maintain two things at once. It was trying to maintain being Jewish and also trying to maintain your identity in a world that rejected you. Trying to be German and be Jewish, whatever German Jew meant. And the problem was that the Orthodox world hated Jew because they thought that he was a sellout, and the Germans never really accepted Jew either. And you could do anything almost, right? I think of people like Husserl. Husserl was a great German philosopher whose son fought in World War I and still got fired when the Nazis took him. They never could become Jewish enough. In fact, even for the anti-Semites, for the Nazis, the more the Jews assimilated, the more dangerous they were. They were almost hiding amongst you. And so there was something about this that the strategy of assimilation was always going to be at some level a losing game. But what ends up happening in the academic world is that, or at least in the religious world, rather, I should say, is that Judaism early on had to basically come to look like Lutheranism. They had to make a Judaism that looked as much like the Lutheranism of the 19th and 20th century as possible. And that movement became the Reform movement, right? Ethical monotheism. And if you look at the Lutheran movement and the early Reform movement, it is amazing how similar they are. Even the choir, it's just like the organs and stuff, right? If you've ever been to a classical Reform synagogue, the organs, the choir, and they even moved Shabbat to Sunday mornings and all kinds of stuff. They were desperately trying to fit in. And again, at one level, one way of looking at that is they're trying to sell out. But again, I think that the more that you accuse them of that, you need to walk a mile in their shoes and understand how devastating the reality of anti-Semitism was at that time and how awful it would get. And at the same time, I admire them. I admire the courage it takes to try to figure out a way of being German and Jewish, being French and Jewish in a world that you basically rejected by both sides, no matter what you do. I think it's very heroic and a very difficult path to march. On the academic front, part of what had to happen to justify the viability of Judaism is to justify it to the world of the theologians, and that's the theologians largely of Lutheran theology in the mid and late 19th century, which, as you probably imagine, as you may know even, German scholarship at this time was some of the most amazing scholarship in the world when it comes to Bible. This is a time period where critical source theory was being developed. This is a time where the Bible's being systematically studied, scientifically studied for the first time. This is where Hebrew is really getting into the manuscripts of these things. It's really a time period of enormous erudition. In fact, I would say that German biblical scholarship of 10 years probably produced more erudite scholarship than has been produced 30 years of what we did. It's amazing. These guys, and they just knew 15 languages. They just did. That's just how they worked. They didn't have the whole Bible. They just had chunks of the Hebrew Bible memorized. So the scholarship was very driven by Lutheran, pietist, very careful scholarship. And so what ends up emerging at the same time is the attitude to do the same thing in Judaism. And the attitude to do the same thing in Judaism was largely spearheaded by a group of Jewish Haskalah scholars, and this movement became known as the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement. And Raza, I'm going to beg your forgiveness if I mispronounce my German stuff as I go. So the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, the scientific study of Jewish books, was a movement in the academic Jewish world to study Jewish literature using all the modern tools at that time of German scholarship to study religious literature. And they had to make a decision about what they studied, because what they studied and what they published basically represented Judaism to the outside academic world. So, what did they study? What did they publish? Well, they focused their energy on the Talmud. Why? Because the Talmud, for one, is a highly systematic, highly argumentative book based on logic. They can argue that Judaism is rational because the Talmud is rational. The Talmud is a book of arguments driven by logic, and therefore Judaism is logical. Right? So we have the ethical components in the Hebrew Bible, and we have the logical components of the Talmud, and therefore Judaism is respectable because it's a paragon of logic. Well, guess what isn't terribly logical? Kabbalah. So, what did the Wissenschaft do? what the Wissenschaft movement do? Ignored it. Basically pretended that it wasn't there. Why? Because it was embarrassing. It was superstition. It was occultism. It was nonsense, made up, fraudulent stuff. For them, for the Wissenschaft movement, Kabbalah was an embarrassment to be put back into the darkness of the Middle Ages because it made Jews look crazy. If you've been listening to some of the stuff I've been saying over the past 14 weeks and thinking to yourself, God, that sounds nuts. Well, it does sound nuts. And can you imagine a bunch of Jewish scholars presenting that to a bunch of erudite Lutheran scholars being like, yes, Jews, we believe that God masturbated reality for the What? That's not going to fly, right? It's going to make them hate you. It's going to reinforce every negative stereotype about the Jews. The Jews are irrational. They're driven by superstition. They believe in nonsense. The Wissenschaft students had to make a decision, and the decision was not Kabbalah, Talmud. And so early on, Kabbalistic literature was largely put on the back burner, to put it politely. And as you might know, at the same time this is happening, this is also the same time that all of the movements in Judaism are beginning to form. The Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Authority movement, the Reconstructionist movement begins in the early 20th century. All of the movements, even modern Orthodox Judaism, all of the movements in movement Judaism in the non-traditional Jewish world, all of them look at some level at this Wissenschaft movement, and they base their Judaism at some level on the Judaism being pumped out by places like JTS, by places like German Scholarship, by places like Cincinnati, Reformed Seminary. And guess what? None of those places are doing. None of them are doing Kabbalah. Why? Because it's embarrassing. They do not want to look like crazy people. So the Kabbalah is totally sidelined for 2.5, 3 generations by scholars. Completely sidelined. And it's sidelined at a decisive moment in Jewish history. What is that decisive moment? The emergence of movements. So if you grew up in a movement, Reform movement, Conservative movement, you grew up in any of the movements, their scholars were simply not being trained on Kabbalah. And because they weren't being trained on it, they couldn't teach it. Because they didn't teach it, it was abandoned. This is the reason why, for folks who grew up, especially for folks who are a bit older than me, if you grew up in the movement Judaism world, you never heard about Kabbalah. There's a reason why. Because the rabbis you had never learned about it. And that's because the generation before them never learned about it. The generation before them made decisions not to learn about it. And that's what happened. Effectively, Kabbalah becomes decanonized by the modern Jewish. Modern Judaism basically decanonized. So the Zohar, Sefer Yetzirah, all the literature we talked about, basically goes back on the shelf. And what comes back is Talmud, if you're lucky, but mostly Tanakh. That's the reason why you will never really see movements until recently. Studies of Kabbalah, studies of Talmud, even Talmud. I mean, for folks who grew up in the movement world, how often did you all study Talmud? How often was Talmud something that you would be encouraged to study or heard about much? I see heads shaking. No, yeah, even Talmud, right? Even Talmud was sidelined. You can imagine Talmud sidelined, then surely Zohar will be sidelined. So that's one part of the story. A huge part of the story is that Kabbalah didn't go away. They still did Kabbalah, studied Kabbalah in the traditional world. It's in the progressive world that it was abandoned. It was decanonized in our world. And it's only now limping back into canonization. And I think it needs to be recanonized or more than that. Of course, the other thing that happens at this time is in the mid-20th century, and there's no way to avoid the elephant in the room, is of course the Holocaust. The Holocaust devastated, obviously, European Jewry, but in terms of Kabbalah, it really devastated the Hasidic world. And the reason why it devastated the Hasidic world, as you might imagine, is the Hasidic Jews live basically in these very tight-knit social networks. They are distinctively dressed. They look very Jewish. They have payas. They dress like Jews. Targeting them was the easiest thing in the world. They all live in the same shtetls and ghettos. So liquidating them and killing them, putting them on these cattle farms was very, very easy for the Nazis. So the Hasidic world was incredibly destroyed in the Holocaust. I think, unfortunately, and Roz would be obviously the better expert of this than I would be, that the Hasidic world suffered apocalyptic levels of devastation in the Holocaust, just because of they were basically sitting ducks, and also their theology prevented them from leaving. So many of them, because they rejected Zionism, did not try to flee to Palestine. They thought it was religiously repugnant to Palestine, because they were also tied to the Rebbe. They also didn't want to individually leave, right? They were tied to this person. And so if the Rebbe didn't leave, they didn't leave. And last and right, the part. When the Einsatzgruppe group moves in, they're there. They're living in that shtetl, and they're there with that Rebbe. And it doesn't take but an afternoon of a really blackout drunk group of Einsatzgruppe to do the deed, to basically eliminate an entire Hasidic dynasty. And Chas v'shalom, that happened. It happened over and over and over again in Eastern Europe, especially Hungary was especially badly hit. I think 1 in 4 Satmar were killed or something like that in the Holocaust. It's just a devastating, apocalyptic story. And as you know, the only people keeping the light on at this time, in many ways, for Kabbalah are Hasidic people. It's the people in Eastern Europe. It's the traditional people. They're the ones keeping the lights on. And with their execution by the beasts that were the Nazis, the light goes out. The light went out. And it was a devastating blow to Kabbalah. Now, luckily, our Sephardic brothers and sisters, Sephardic folks, they were still doing Kabbalah in Morocco. They were still doing Kabbalah over in Baghdad. Still doing Kabbalah in Northern Africa. So it wasn't like that the devastating blow that was dealt to European Jews meant the end of Kabbalah. But it is just important to say that the Hasidic movement and European Jewry was a very important center of the development in Kabbalah, and the Holocaust uniquely and profoundly destroyed some elements of that continuity. Luckily, they did survive, and they would regroup, some of them in America. And in fact, the two largest groups, Satmar would eventually, so in fact the Satmar Rebbe title bomb eventually made its way out even before the war, or in the middle of the war, and the Lubavitch Rebbe also made it out as well, and they refounded their Hasidic dynasty in Brooklyn, Holy Land, real Holy Land, which is Brooklyn. So Borough Park and Crown Heights, respectively. You can go visit the Holy Land. It's just right over there in Brooklyn. You folks know this, right? That Israel is just a borough of Brooklyn. So the real Holy Land is over there, just around Coney Island. So the rebound, folks. The rebound. How did this all rebound? We have the Holocaust. We have the Haskalah. We have the Wissenschaft Judentum movement. How did this rebound? Well, it rebounded in a couple different ways. The rebound, in many ways, began with a young, maverick philologist. People forget that Gerhard Scholem, also people forget that he was Gerhard Scholem. He got Gershomized later when he made Aliyah, but Gerhard Scholem was a young, maverick philologist. He studied language. That's the reason why his scholarship is so top-notch. We read everything in the original language. And Scholem made the crazy argument that Kabbalah deserves to be academically studied. It just deserves academic. It's part of Jewish history. We need to study it. And so in the 1920s, Gerhard would do all the heavy lifting of reading basically every single Kabbalist book he could get his hands on in the archives. Every single one. And being the good German scholar that he was, he did that. And unlike the Wissenschaft Judentum movement that rejected the importance of Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, Gerhard Scholem argued convincingly that there simply was no Judaism without Kabbalah. You couldn't imagine Judaism without it. Judaism was just as important, or Kabbalah was just as important in the history of Judaism as Talmud, as anything else. So Scholem argued over the time that Kabbalah had to be reintegrated both academically and historically into the history and thinking about what Judaism was. And this was by no means easy, folks. When Scholem, who was already an established scholar at the time, was invited to speak at JTS, there's a lecture at JTS at the Jewish Theological Seminary there in New York, when he was allowed to speak, the justification for him being able to speak was that, look, the Kabbalah is nonsense, right? Kabbalah is Narishkeit. Kabbalah is nonsense, but, right, Narishkeit is Narishkeit. Aber the Geschichte des Narishkeit, das ist Wissenschaft. Right? Nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is science. So Kabbalah is nonsense, but the history of Kabbalah is science. It's worth studying as historical information, but God forbid anyone repeat Kabbalah. That's ridiculous. That, by the way, was coming from the most famous progressive Talmud scholar in 20th century history, Saul Lieberman, probably one of the most important Talmud scholars of the early 20th century, the Talmud professor at JTS, basically invented modern sort of quasi-secular Talmud education. Saul Lieberman. That's how Sholem was introduced. Can you imagine being introduced at the JTS by basically saying, yeah, what you study is nonsense, but because you study it as history, as something we used to do, it's legitimate. But God forbid anyone actually be a Kabbalist. That's completely crazy. So Sholem really had to walk an uphill battle. He fought an uphill battle the entire time to get legitimacy for what he was doing, which is unimaginable now, considering that Kabbalah is so legitimate, so mainstream. But Sholem had to fight that battle, and in many ways he was gone. Luckily, he was a very capable scholar, and he was able to do it. Sholem brought with him an army of students. He attracted a great deal of students, folks like Moshe Idel and Don, other folks who've gone on to become themselves leading scholars in the world of Kabbalah. His students were also perfectly willing to criticize him, and they did. They made careers criticizing him. Folks like Moshe Idel really showed how important Sholem was, and also how incomplete Sholem was. And we have a whole new generations of scholars who leaves, Zahi Weiss, and all kinds of stuff. Running Moroz is a huge group of scholars that blow my mind with every book that they write. And so the academic study of Kabbalah is landed. It is now totally legit if you want to study Kabbalah in college. You can take an academic level Kabbalah class, and no one's going to back down. Sure, it's part of Jewish history. At the same time, there is an emerging, relatively small movement of religious Zionism, led by Rav Kook, and he would eventually give rise to religious Zionism. Know it, although Rav Kook wasn't terribly influenced by, wasn't a huge Kabbalist, but certainly a lot of the luring themes of exile and redemption would play a part in the rise of Zionism. The most important, I think, Kabbalist to come really in the early to mid-20th century would be Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, Baal HaSulam, the master of the ladder. And the Baal HaSulam would make Aliyah in Israel, and he would compose two incredibly influential works. The most important, I think, is his commentary on the Zohar, a text that he took, I think, 10 years to write, called Hasulam, the ladder. And this is both an introduction to the Zohar, but also a commentary on the Zohar. And he translated Zohar out of the crazy Aramaic that it's in to a very modern Hebrew to make it accessible to a whole generation of people who otherwise would not be able to read in the original Aramaic. He published it in basically modern Hebrew, modern Lashon Kodesh Hebrew, and so it's much more accessible in the modern Hebrew. So many people who read Zohar now in the Orthodox world, and also many people who study Isaac Luria are going to study many of his ideas at some level through the lens of Rabbi Ashlag, who also developed his own sort of interesting communist theory. There's, in fact, I think a kibbutz that's based on some of his ideals in northern Israel, Calvinist. So Yehuda Ashlag becomes a very important, I think, probably the most important character. Another character that I don't mention in this, that I can't believe I left out, of course, is Rabbi Nachum ben Schneerson, blessed memory. Schneerson, of course, was the head of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and what's important to know about him is that he became one of the most important founders of the Kiruv movement, that is to say, the outreach movement among Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews. So he moved into a Chabad house, and that's because Rebbe sent someone to make one, basically, at least most of them. And Menachem Mendel Schneerson founded this enormous Kiruv network of the Chabad movement, and he was just a hugely important figure in the history of 20th century Judaism. It's really hard to downplay all the really important things that he did. But one of the things that's worth mentioning here that's important and will be important for going into 21st century Judaism is that when he died in the 90s, it was already believed in his lifetime that he was the Messiah, and then when he died, people really began to believe he was the Messiah. And so there is a movement in the Chabad world, not a super big movement, I don't think it's as big as it was in the late 90s, and it seems to be mostly localized to Brooklyn and Israel, especially in Chabad, where they believe he's the Messiah. Also, I have a so anyway, the Menachem Mendel Schneerson was believed to be the Messiah, and I studied briefly at a Chabad yeshiva, and I definitely met people who believed that he was not only not dead, but that he had been taken into heaven somehow bodily, and that he was going to return really soon, and that his return would be heralded by Jews adopting more Torah, and that basically it was kind of occluded, and his occultation would promote in, and the Rebbe would reappear as the King Messiah. Of course, you can still go to Crown Heights, you can still go to Brooklyn, and you can still see crowns, images of the Rebbe's flag, which has a yellow with a crown that says Mashiach on it, the Messiah. So there's this huge messianic movement, which again can be a whole class unto itself, inside of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, where they do believe that their late leader is the Messiah. This is causing some serious problems in the Chabad movement because it is such a movement based on outreach. Although in my experience and what I've been told by folks who have grown up in the movement is that largely the kind of people that the messianic
Louis, how are you?
Oh, hi.
Excellent. Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, have you got a way of recording this?
I am recording, but I don't have a way to record on my phone.
Okay. So you're Rabbi Rothschild?
That's correct.
Right, and where are you based?
I'm based out of Irvine, California.
California.
Correct.
Under the irresponsible leadership of Gavin Newsom.
Some may say that.
What do you think?
Oh, I do my best to not get political, but I know that his term is up this year, and from there, hopefully, he takes some time off and
Yeah,
maybe
I think
just.
I think he's gonna try and run.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. Have you got a way to record this and save the file and send it over to me, and I'll put it on my thing?
Well, like I said, not on my phone. Do you normally run podcasts?
Not through Zoom, no. I've only ever done it in person.
Oh, okay. All right. So let me see how we could do this. Can you screen record on your phone?
Annoyingly, no. Can you?
I don't have the space necessarily for the file. Okay, but that's all right. We can figure out something. Let's see. Well, first and foremost, let's get to know each other a little bit. And as I say that, maybe I can get a file over to you, or we could figure it out. Okay, so what kind of podcast do you have? May I ask?
Okay, so the first one was simply me doing a version of Family Business by Kanye West. Then the next one was a conversation with me and my friend James Weir and my friend Rabbi Rothschild.
Can you repeat that?
When I recorded a conversation about Iran and all sorts of things with my friend James Weir and Rabbi Rothschild.
Yes.
And then after that, I had a conversation with the next. So the States, right? Are you a soccer fan?
To some extent, yeah.
Okay, so when I was younger, I'm a footballer from a team. So in my town of Bristol, where I am, I'm in the southwest of England.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I met up with him. He's called Clinton Ellis. He's a lovely fella. And we had a conversation about football and things like that. And then
Okay, so this will be your fourth podcast?
this will be the 13th.
Oh, 13th. Okay, excellent. So you've done quite a few of them. All right.
Yeah, and the most recent one is me and my friend Matt Watts talking about tennis.
Oh, okay. Very well.
Yeah, because I was introduced. Oh, you were in a Harry Potter shirt.
Yeah. Do you know about the cryptocurrency Harry Potter Obama Sonic Taninu?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's a cryptocurrency that sponsor all my merchandise and such, and that's why I have this shirt on. But yeah, it's the name of the cryptocurrency. It's worth tens of millions of dollars. Apologies, I'm just getting my lighting set up, and then
I don't know how to record.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll I'll figure out a way. There's a way in Zoom. Do you have just the standard Zoom plan? If you do, that's okay. I'm live streaming. Let me see if I can send you a link to restream. Do you mind if I tell you a little bit about myself?
No, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. So, yes, I'm Rabbi Rothschild. I stream my life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for world peace. I've been doing so for more than 4 years. Have you ever seen the television show Big Brother or the movie The Truman Show?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So it's very similar to that. Essentially, I have more data archived on the internet than any person in global history, which is a really big deal. It's an emerging emerging as continuous human infrastructure and also continuous human activity data. So basically studying a human from all aspects, eating, sleeping, behavior, I think will be of extreme benefit, perhaps not just to AI in the future, but to generations. It's basically like a timeline or a time capsule of human achievement.
Are you Truman Burbank in this analogy?
Yeah, that would be correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. So as for the recording option, I think I can send you a link and you can join. And so just one moment, and I'm gonna